Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight to hear
Thank you.
about One Life, winner of the Feature Film Period category at the 13th British Film Designers Guild Award in February. Sorry, it's still playing. Apologies for that. The Guild was formed over 75 years ago with the aim of raising the standards and profile of the art department and protecting the interests of its members, and those core principles still apply today. We're a fantastic community of over 600 accredited skilled technicians and designers whose talents span the various branches of the art department in film and television. If you'd like to leave any questions for our panel to answer, please post them in the chat box and I'll do my best to get to them at the end. One Life tells the story of Nicholas Winton, a London broker who rescued 669 Jewish children from the Nazis. 50 years later, and still haunted by the guilt of not being able to save more, he's surprised on live TV when he's introduced to many of those children that he saved that were now adults. And it's a fascinating story, beautifully told and crafted. And I'd like to introduce to you Philippa and Christina to tell us all about it. So Philippa Hart is the set decorator and Christina Moore, production designer. So can I start with you, Christina, and maybe you can just tell us about how you came about this project and also maybe give us a little bit of history about your working background.
Hello, thank you everyone for listening in. Yes, so I started out, I trained as an architect and I worked as an architect for a couple of years after I qualified before realizing that I didn't quite have the attention span for that. And I was really interested as a student in narrative storytelling, which didn't really translate into architectural practice. And for whatever reason, it hadn't really occurred to me that you could have a career telling stories in film and television, and it wasn't that difficult a job to being an architect. But I went to film school, I went to the National Film and Television School, and after I left, I think because I had already had a career as an architect, I was able to jump through sort of lowlier hoops quite quickly and worked my way up through the art department in various capacities, being a junior art director, supervising art director for many years in tandem with designing my own smaller projects, and now fully fledged production designer. And in fact, the first feature film that I ever worked on was where I met Philippa, and that was Sense and Sensibility, the amazing film directed by Ang Lee. And it was my first job from film school, and I was the storyboard artist, which was an unusual role to come from the film school. Quite a nerve-wracking one for me because I didn't really feel I was a proper storyboard artist, and it involved sitting around sketching all of the amazing actors in it in period costume and on horseback. And from a young age, I'd always been quite unable to draw horses. I wasn't a horsey person at all, and I would have the likes of Hugh Grant looking over my shoulder, commenting on my sketches. It was baptism of fire, but incredibly interesting to be working alongside Ang Lee and on an amazing production. And it was Luciana Origi, who was the production designer, who has mentored and helped so many people that I know in the film industry to get started. And I'm very grateful for her. She's a really inspiring head of department. And of course, it was wonderful to meet Philippa, and we continued to work together in different roles on different projects for many years since then. I don't know whether you want to go over to Philippa now or whether I should talk about One Life. Maybe Philippa should say her route.
Sure. Let's talk about how Philippa got into the industry.
Well, mine was more an organic route. It wasn't as sort of as official in a path. And I was at university and I studied art history, and then I worked in the art world. And when my job on conservation on Spencer House, which is a 18th century town palace on Green Park, came to an end after about 7 years on the conservation project there. I was either going to go into working in the amenity groups, particularly for the National Heritage Memorial Fund, or my interest in design and film took me on to Sense and Sensibility with Luciana Origi, particularly because I had been used to working in the National Trust and with a lot of the locations that she was involved with. And I'd worked with English Heritage and yeah, the V&A and the National Trust, as I say. So it sort of worked from, that was my springboard. And I was very fortunate to have joined her and met Christina. And yes, again, that was a baptism of fire, but it was a wonderful learning curve. And Luciana took me on. I did sort of 4 films with her after that. And that was my national film school, as you like. That was my training.
Great, thank you. And so, Christina, One Life, how did that come about for you?
Well, that came about. I'd worked with the producer Guy Healy in different roles. Initially as an art director, supervising art director, on a couple of films designed by Andrew McAlpine, who I've worked with a few times, and then I had done another film called Summerland, which I did with Philippa, which he had produced, and then this film came along. So he was keen to put me forward to James Hall's the director, and it was obviously a fascinating project, really intriguing, and I was very fortunate enough to get it. It had a slightly checkered past, like lots of projects that were around pre and post pandemic. It had been ready to go pre-pandemic with a bigger budget, totally different directorial and producers crew attached to it, names attached to it, to being developed by Seesaw. And then the pandemic happened, and when it came back later, it was like lots of projects were, it was in a sort of reduced format. And I guess, to be honest, that was probably worked to my benefit, because I think having worked on bigger things as an art director and supervising art director, especially Game of Thrones, which is where I sort of ended up that part of my career, since I've been designing, I've been doing much smaller things, and think I've probably shown that I can manage smaller budgets and period things, which I had done including with Guy. So I think it's worked to my advantage.
Brilliant. And maybe let's start with talking about what were the biggest challenges on this movie for you as a department.
Well, I think as a department, I don't know, Philippa, please interrupt if you disagree. The main challenges were that along with a smaller budget and smaller schedule, there wasn't any reduction in the ambition of the project. We had a true story, we had an epic story. The director was sort of very sort of fiercely engaged with being as accurate as possible in the telling of it. He felt it was, and we all felt it was, our responsibility to the real people involved. We felt it had a contemporary urgency because of what had been happening in Ukraine, which was unfolding sort of in front of our eyes. And the biggest challenges were therefore the sort of lack of resources and time, but especially I think the fact that we were shooting across 2 different countries in 2 timeframes, pretty much sort of seamlessly going from one to the other. There wasn't a sort of stop-start in order to prep that. So that was challenging for both of us because we had teams to manage in each country, and probably especially in the Czech Republic, where we were going to do all of the earlier time period, apart from just a very minimal amount of exterior work. And I think especially for Philippa, sourcing all of the set dressing things for different countries from Prague was a real challenge. Perhaps you want to talk about that, Phil?
Yes, no, we briefly spoke about it before, but I mean, Prague is brilliant in its sort of resources and makes a lot of things. Its craftsmen are next to none, and that's wonderful, but they don't have the prop houses that we are very fortunate in having here. Berlin is a step up, that's for sure, and so we were able to gather quite a few good props from there, but there was a lot of sort of ferrying back and forth, and also from the producer's point of view, obviously it was beneficial to use everything in those countries, but given we were doing English 1930s on quite a few of those sets, that proved pretty challenging. So we did end up having to take some things over.
I was going to ask if you had to ship much stuff over and whether that was a possibility. That has all sorts of issues just on its own, but
Well, perversely, we did actually have to do ship things from Prague to the UK as well. And maybe if I just share a few photographs, I might start
Yeah,
with
great.
some things about trains. Obviously, we had quite a lot. Hang on, is this working? Oh, let me just try and tell me if you can see this. Is that showing? Can you see that?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
Yep.
so I've just been trying to put together not a great presentation, I'm afraid, just a few things. I think a lot of this story was about transport, about urgency, about means of transport, both, especially obviously in the earlier period, but also in the present day. So, you know, different things we had going on, and especially the Kindertransport being about trains. So we had various challenges. We had the key stations in the story were Wilson Station in Prague, which is still very much the centre of European transport, and in fact, this is where the Ukrainian refugees, women and children, were arriving very heartbreakingly when we went on our first recce. And just showing some pictures of Wilson Station as it is now, still a very busy station. And in both of the stations I'm going to talk about, there are actually these statues to Nicholas Winton. So we had Wilson Station, and here is some details of what we're doing there. So including Philippa showing us not showing us her credentials, but the things one has to do. We actually almost got arrested because we were hanging these up. We needed to see what size flags we needed, and we hadn't informed the police, or the transport police weren't aware of it, and they did try to arrest us with the props team for hanging up these Nazi banners in the middle of a very busy Wilson station, which was appalling. So, so this is showing kind of set dressing. This is showing the kind of things the art department had to do. Obviously, lots of cover up. So we wanted to have a huge epic scene. We couldn't possibly cover up everything that was there. And to my horror, when you even on the little trailer, you can see some signs that haven't been digitally replaced because we covered up the ones we thought would be key, and everything else was supposed to be done digitally, but it wasn't. But so big hoardings that were built. This is Alnor, one of our members of the art department in Prague, things that other people may be aware of if you use something like vac form, which we decided to use to cover up all the glass in imitation of the metalwork that was elsewhere in the station. And there was a lot of glass modern things. If you use vac form, you don't get a construction crew to do it. The art department has to do it themselves. So we were there very late at night, obviously working around a very busy train schedule, sticking vac form up, not incredibly professionally, wobbly vac form, seen in the backgrounds, sort of get away with it.
Yeah, it worked very well.
And yes, in the front of the station as well, where we had various different action vehicles. It was an extremely busy sort of triple carriageway, which we couldn't stop. So again, we were very limited in what we could actually do there, but we really wanted to use this station. It was really iconic to our story. It's the real place where it happened, and it was challenging, but it worked very well. And these are some reference images that we had of Wilson Station at the time, and these horrific scenes of the refugees who were leaving on the Kindertransport, and actually just waiting, having arrived in Prague, not sure where they were going to go next. Another thing, slightly jumping around here, is that our character Nicholas Winton is a photographer as well as a stockbroker, and the way that he used images was hugely important for him to use as a propaganda tool back in England to try and raise money. He had to do this incredibly quickly, and he used publicity, and he also had to document the children in terms of all the paperwork for their passes that were needed. And we had an amazing photographer who we worked with in Prague, who was a Czech photographer who still used a plate camera, and we would take pictures of any of our extras where we had them, and these ones were in the station. The other station that we had, the arrival point in England, was Liverpool Street Station. Again, this is the real Liverpool Street. This is the equivalent memorial to Nicholas Winton. And when we first started, we were hoping we might be able to use a little bit of Liverpool Street. It soon became obvious that we couldn't possibly do that. It would be way too expensive, and probably not really able to do it with the sort of period trains would need to get in. So we looked at other places, and Didcot became somewhere that had I had period rolling stock. I've become a real nerd about trains, that the difference between Czech trains and English trains, the different gauges, the different heights of the platforms, they're really very different trains. We could only get English stock in the UK. We couldn't afford to transport anything to Prague, and we couldn't find any English rolling stock that was in Europe, and there's a different gauge. So it became our idea that we would shoot almost everything in 2 different stations in the Czech Republic, in Wilson Station and one in the north called Liberec. And we would match it with English rolling stock for all the detail stuff in Didcot, which is what we did in this small train station. But what we, in terms of, I said we were importing things both ways, we ended up, as you can see from Liverpool Street, it has these really gigantic columns. And we could never really replicate that in the scale of the locations we were going to be in. But we used it as a design inspiration, if you like, to make these much smaller columns, which we had made in Prague. It was both cheaper for us to do that, and we were going to need them there later. And we made them there first. This is the workshop in Prague. And then we shipped them back over to the UK to put them up in the same order that we were going to see them in the station at Liberec. We also had the floor of Liberec station printed in Prague on lino, and that we had that shipped over as well. So, and we then had to ship the columns back to Liberec. So it was a bit crazy. And here you can see what we did in Liberec, which is we have the columns, which are as big as we could really make them to fit over all these, there were many, many more columns in Liberec. So we had to cover these up, and they could only come to this height because of the architecture that was there. And then they were sort of replaced with visual effects later, which you saw a little bit in that trailer of Nicholas Winton tragically waiting for the last train, which doesn't arrive, with the last lot of children who are never heard from again. And these are just a few drawings of the kinds of things that we had to do to cover up all the signage in Liberec station. You can see here, this is the waiting room, which we transformed into Liverpool Street Station waiting room by painting it a different colour, creating a large signboard for the different trains, and doing quite a lot of graphics that looked like English station graphics. And here, this is a still showing Nicholas Winton's mother, who comes to greet the kinder when they arrive. And then, just as a little coda to that, we then ended up a few months after we finished shooting, the cut had come together really well, and suddenly there was a bit more money to do some reshoots. And we had a new scene on a London tube, which was basically, again, to use Nicholas Winton's propaganda machine to sort of ratchet up the tension. And so we had another sort of train, different kind of graphics. And we also had an aeroplane, which was, again, the first part of the Kindertransport was transporting really small numbers of children out of the country on a plane. And again, getting a period appropriate plane had to be flown in from a different country, different graphics to make it look Czech. Anyway, that's a transport aside.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. That's a lovely insight into the kind of work that goes on these productions. It's you have to be so inventive, don't you, to kind of problem solve. There's a question coming from the chat, actually, which is a good time to ask. What kind of permission is required when covering things up, and who do you approach to get such permission?
Well, you do always need to get permission. I mean, obviously, what I've been showing you there are mainly in quite controlled places because they're within stations. So you have to cover things up, but there are always things for health and safety that you can't cover up, that you have to sort of either do very much to camera or just assume you're going to need to do digitally at the end. I would say that it's a lot easier working in countries outside of the UK, where they tend to be a bit more flexible. So you definitely need permission from all the authorities. And in England, yes, it would be, it would be pretty strict about individual, like we had lots of things in, in fact, I think I probably left out the very last slide on that one, which was the coach in Maidenhead High Street. But that was, it was a high street, so you had a lot of individual shops to cover up. So you obviously needed permission from each individual landlord. And then there were a number of things that were street furniture that you need permission from the council to do. You need to allow a lot of time for that. And there's always, even obviously when you're doing a period thing which is set in the 30s, it's clearly obvious you need to cover up a lot. But even things that are pretty much contemporary, as I'm sure most people listening to this will be aware, for copyright reasons, you have to cover them up. So we're constantly working with the graphics team, with the art department, to find ways to remove things that we aren't allowed to see.
Thank you. And I guess it's a good time to ask about research, because obviously being a period piece, I imagine the researcher is really quite critical. And is there much kind of supporting documentation that exists that kind of gives you some insight into what things look like and what things existed that there's reference to?
Do you want to talk about that, Philippa?
Well, yes, because it was a real story. We had a lot of real elements to draw upon, and that's always wonderful working on any period project. But because it was a historical real project, and in fact Nicholas Winton's daughter had written the book, but in terms of actual, I mean, for me, for the set dressing side of things, there was quite a lot of documentation on Nicholas Winton's life and the historical element of the Sudetenland and the Nazis invading for 1938. There's a lot of documentation on it. So, but there's a lot of reading as well as source material, visual source material, which is wonderful to draw upon. It's always worth reading the literature, because that's when you can draw upon little nuggets that you don't get on film often, particularly from a set dressing point of view.
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree that obviously we were lucky that there was quite a lot of literature from the people that Nicholas Winton worked with, because obviously he wasn't operating alone in the Czech Republic and back at home. So we had various accounts. There's not very much photographic evidence from that time, so piecing together things like that is a bit more challenging. But we certainly, I think our research was really for our resources was really thorough, and we did spend, I think the graphics was painstakingly researched. A lot of the storytelling, particularly how it's framed going between the two time periods, is using a scrapbook which was created at the end of the earlier period in the 30s, after the transports come to an end, and it's a document of all the different processes that the people involved in it, including Nicholas Winton, had to go through. And this is the piece that is so powerful when it is shown on That's Life. And we had access to a digital copy of that, so we could recreate all of that very, very accurately. But also, I think that led on to other things. So you can go to the War Museum, and there are really good things you can actually see, physical things that you can look at and take photographs of there. So I would say that we always tried to be as accurate as we possibly could with this, but inevitably there are things that you have to take a creative leap with. And I would say with both of the interiors that we had, with the two houses, and that are the key sort of anchors for the two time periods. We knew physically where they were, but we weren't in the actual houses, and we didn't actually have any photographs of what their interiors look like. So that is a sort of a creative decision to go the way we went with those.
Mm-hmm. And how much prep time did you have, just out of interest, for because there's obviously quite a lot of research to do?
I can't remember. Can you? I mean, it was a very short.
I think it was
a 6-week shoot.
6 weeks
very, very quick.
And I think we either had 8 or 7 weeks prep.
Right.
I think I might have had 10 weeks prep, because obviously we were scouting in quite a wide area between two countries, and I think most of the art department had 7 or 8 weeks prep. It was a 6-week shoot, which was very tight.
I guess with such profound subject matter, there's probably an extra layer of pressure on you to get everything accurate. There's kind of like probably a feeling of responsibility towards the people that are portrayed in the film.
Definitely, that was the case. I mean, I would specifically like to talk about the Kinder. Obviously, it was amazing how different descendants of Kinder kept sort of popping up through our research, through people that we met. And in fact, we had a brilliant graphic designer who had two grandparents who had both been on a Kindertransport. So for her,
Wow,
the connection with the story was intense, and the responsibility was sort of likewise sort of, you know, really significant. And she did a brilliant job of being as accurate as she possibly could be. And perhaps I might just share a little bit of some of, I mean, it's a bit mixed up and everything else. I've sort of grouped my images slightly by set, but the graphics obviously appear in every set. It's a very, very graphics heavy show. I just will show a little bit of Willow Road, which will, you know, Philippa, do please jump in. It started out, like I said, we knew where Nicholas Winton lived, and this is the house that he lived in Willow Road, which the people that live there at the moment weren't keen for us to use, but we wanted it to be as accurate as possible, and I used it as a starting point when I was first briefing. The decision had been made for reasons of economy to build the interior in Prague rather than try and find a real interior in London or build it in the UK. So I was trying to brief the Czech team on what we would need at this point to build the ground floor interior of this house. This was the house that we ended up using, which is also on Willow Road, the actual road, but it's a bit further down the street. It was a bit easier to use because it was slightly larger. And then this shows the set we ended up building, which for various reasons, well, entirely to do with economy, it was built inside another set on a location just outside Prague. So it was quite compromised by that. But I mean, economically, it worked really well. It was quite challenging for us. Which was this location here, so we're building it on a first floor sort of ballroom of a chateau in the Czech Republic. I'm just whizzing through this. It's not this isn't to do with graphics, obviously, but it does show different kinds of challenges. So we had quite a low ceiling height, we had a limited footprint, and to make matters worse, we had to use this set in another set without our Willow Road set in it. So we had to keep a corridor free, which was part of our glamorous Prague hotel. So it was full of challenges, this job, and you can sort of see here, I think, quite how small the set had to be, that the real ceiling of the rooms is visible through our set ceiling. And in order to create any kind of backing outside the back windows, we had to build walls within this ballroom, which were quite small. And here we are. It's beautiful, beautiful set dressing. I mean, it did look great, and in fact, the fact it was very small and claustrophobic worked quite well for the story, which is, it basically is Nicholas Winton's home that he lives in with his mother, and it becomes their centre of operations when they're starting to get the children out, and it becomes an office where all of the paperwork, which is mounting up and up because of the bureaucracy imposed, unfortunately, by the British Home Office, takes over the whole set, as you can see a bit here. So this is as it's starting out. And then this is really what I wanted to talk about here, was about the layers of bureaucracy and all of the paperwork that had to be filled in. The situation is becoming more and more urgent as the likelihood of war being declaring, and this brief corridor out of Prague becoming closed permanently for the duration of the war. Photographs of children. Basically, Nicholas Winton is trying to find people to adopt children, and it becomes more and more urgent. So huge amounts of paperwork there. That is sort of really, really detailed. What you can't actually see here is all of these are the lists of all of the children who are going to be on each one of the transports, and they were as accurate as we could possibly be. You see lots of close-ups in the storytelling of names being crossed off, and they are very, very accurate. Strangely, just as one of the perverse things about filmmaking, when we came to do our reshoots, we had to rebuild part of this set because of all the complications of storytelling to do with the graphics. There hadn't been time to shoot that. So we rebuilt our set, which had been built in this quite small, cramped location in the Czech Republic, in quite a large location in Twickenham, which was quite surreal to suddenly end up with so much space. But anyway, that was a bit of an aside. I thought there was more graphics in that. But wanted to share that with you.
I wanted to ask you a question about windows, because obviously you've got no or very little space when you're building a set within a set. How did they light? How did, was it daylight? Were you able to use the real windows, or was it lit from the DOP?
Well, it was lit by the DOP. I mean, it was a compromise because we didn't have enough space, as you said, and there were times when they did want to. We had the front door there, which we used the real front door on the location. But having decided we wanted to be in the real street in Hampstead, there was then kind of nervousness that opposite the front door was actually Hampstead Heath, and that it was felt that audiences wouldn't understand where they were they suddenly in the countryside. So we ended up having to put a green screen on the location for the view from the front door. So we did also have a green screen outside of the windows, where it wasn't an ideal amount of space to light that. And then at the back, we hemmed it in with sort of brick flattage because we didn't have enough room for a proper backing. But also in that part of London, they don't, it's backyards and bricks felt appropriate, and we were mostly looking in the room at the back into the back garden. But we also had to use different kinds of layers of nets in that way that you often have to do to disguise when you're in a studio. I think it worked there because it was such an interior story. I don't think it looked too bad, but obviously there wasn't enough room to do the backings correctly, or even to copy the architecture. The ceiling height in the real house was a lot higher than we were able to do.
Great, thank you. And Philippa, kind of leaning into some of the graphic items and photos, there's so many layers of dressing in the offices, for example, and so many graphics.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about how you achieved that, because it's absolutely crammed.
It completely is crammed.
While you're talking, I'm just going to show in the background another one which will illustrate this well. So you can talk over this, Philippa.
Is it the BCRC?
It is the BCRC.
Yeah. So actually, when we arrived in Prague, our first set was the BCRC, and I remember all these boxes. I explicitly said, we need a lot of paperwork. We need a lot of paperwork. And in the Czech Republic, it seems that their period paperwork is sort of enclosed in these files, and there's a lot of sort of blueprints interspersed with them, and there were just boxes and boxes of these files. And I was going, no, we need loose paperwork. We need loose paperwork. So I remember sort of unpacking all these files to just, extract paperwork. It was from a graphics point of view, because I knew also the director, that's what he wanted. He liked to over embellish the amount that would possibly be real. But, in his head, every time we reached a set, he'd say, no, I want more. So we were briefed from London, particularly, knowing how he liked to work. And so, yes, I mean, it was overcompensating for what we thought would be reality, but it was never enough. So in actual fact, these places were small and cramped, and the offices were small, and it is reported that it was piled up, with all the bureaucracy for the children. So it was real. We as well as being creative and dramatic, we were going from historical evidence.
And that also needed to be accurate. It couldn't really be bumped. I mean, it was.
Yes, cool.
And I like this picture on the right here. This is our standby art director, Suzanne, looking aghast at what she's going to do. Just arrived in Prague with no kind of prep between one and the other, thinking, oh my God, I'm straight in at the deep end, and we're going to be moving this around every 5 minutes, and it's got to be accurate. And what do I do with it all? So yeah, she was absolutely brilliant. But it's just.
At all time.
And how big a graphics team did you have?
We had 2 people in the UK, and we had a trainee who wasn't supposed to be doing graphics, but she ended up doing a lot of graphics. And then in Prague, we had Again, 2 people in Prague, and Gabby, who was our main person in the UK, did work between the two. She did come out to Prague in the end. It wasn't initially planned like that, but there was just so much to do, and because the process of doing all of the kind of documentation, the way that the Kinder had to go through the system, she had, I mean, somewhere I've got her amazing document that explained it all, but she was the person that had really, really forensically understood and studied it all, whereas for us, we didn't really have enough time. I mean, Suzanne was brilliant, but Gabby was the person that really knew about all that, so she was pretty key.
Yeah. The process was very layered. It really was, and it had to be accurately told, and that's why we even had, when we finished filming, the reshoots happened, because, you know, to zone in on the bureaucracy, to reveal those little details, it was essential for the story. So, but it worked. It did seem that it was definitely a graphic-led story.
Yeah, well, they did incredible work. Fabulous. And how was it working across 2 very distinct timelines? Because you're showing the 30s, 40s, and then you're showing the 80s.
Yeah, maybe I'll just show you what we did for the 80s. I mean, the 80s, it was a lovely project, really, because both timelines were very distinct. It wasn't just a period; it was a sort of lyrical difference, really. That there's a real urgency in the 30s thing, time's running out, and in the 80s, it's him sort of looking back on his life in a much more reflective way, with an amazing performance by Anthony Hopkins. So we had a very different way of shooting it. We had different color palette. And we had the character. I mean, obviously, partly because we're working with an elderly character, an elderly actor. We couldn't be rushing around too much, so we had a more leisurely pace of shooting it too. The main thing I would say was that we had to find and create Nicholas Vinton's home, which was quite a big character in the story, and he had been, a fairly successful stockbroker in his career. And he had always been a philanthropist as well. So he lived in Maidenhead. He had built or lived in a sort of 1960s, 70s house. He loved gardening. He loved swimming. So we had a sort of brief for that. He had accreted layers and layers of stuff because of his obsessive philanthropy and the way that he was very, very hands-on throughout his life. So we had a sort of backstory to get into it. So if I maybe just show you the house that we ended up. I mean, we had to find, as I'm sure a lot of people listening to this will understand, we had to find a location that was in London or just outside London. It had to be really accessible for the actors. So we had a bit of a challenge, and we found this rather wonderful house in Mill Hill, which was in a perfect location, and it sort of fitted the box, and it hadn't ever been used before. And I've actually found it on Rightmove, just thinking, house, swimming pool, big garden within a certain radius. And it came up, and they didn't even have very many pictures of the house and none of the interior, because it was really like a building plot, which was very, very sad. It had been built in the early 70s. And we were really lucky that it was a probate sale, and the woman that owned it, the daughter, her parents were Jewish successful haberdashers, and they had also been philanthropists, and she felt this would be a really nice legacy for the house. She didn't really know if it was going to be demolished or not, but it was still very tricky to navigate, because you were dealing with somebody's own childhood home, and their own memories. So it was a very complicated thing, but it was a fantastic house. And so these are the pictures of it when it was dressed. And Philippa, perhaps you'd like to talk about the dressing, because the character studies in it, I think you did so beautifully there.
Well, it was a joy to dress, actually. I mean, tonally, the house and the sort of the vistas and the long lengths of the rooms, it's fairly pared back. We had sort of evidence, obviously, Nicky's background, his Germanic background with his parents, meant that we wanted to put in some sort of European furniture as well. And we knew that he was a pianist, and Anthony Hopkins is a pianist in in his life as well. And actually he's playing the piano in the film. So those kind of elements all brought it together. And yes, the hoarding. So we started off with a bit of hoarding, but actually it was pared back. His wife, Greta, was Danish. So we had this module, yes, that's his hoarding element, that she made him pack into the garage rather than the home, except that the study there, as you can see, yet again, a graphic paperwork pile of elements of his life and his hoarding.
That's how the room looked initially. So this is, you can see where we've taken it to. Yeah.
Yes. So again, that, you know, this was the one area of the house that he was allowed to hoard, and yes, in fact, the other elements. But it sort of slowly gets less and less during the story, as he comes to terms with his past, and so it sort of is reduced during the film as he's left with the, you know, the important book that he goes to meet Betty Maxwell with, and then hence That's Life starts to recount his story. But yes, it's as a set decoration piece, it was a wonderful thing to do.
Well, he did a beautiful job, and with the location. I mean, the location. I mean, shout out to Alini, who was the British art director, who did a fantastic job. And the house, it was an amazing house. This is how it looked when we first found it. I mean, it was really incredibly interesting spatially, and it felt like a pretty good, you know, it was bigger than his actual house was, but it had all of the elements there, and it was a very cinematic space. And it had, you know, importantly, it had the swimming pool, which was a really big part of the story. But the swimming pool hadn't been used for at least 25 years.
So, it doesn't look like it's been used.
Anthony Hopkins is quite a fastidious person, so it was a lot of work to get it back to this, and this beautiful sort of, you know, vision of loveliness at the end. And we were, you know, unfortunately he did agree to go in it, because it was touch and go, I'd say, and it was, the weather was getting chilly as well. So we had to do, you know, a bit of work to the garden, and, you know, certainly interiors we had to do, you know, apart from the set decorating, you know, painting, usual things, bits and pieces. But the actual house itself was a real find, and it was a great character, really, in the story. Oh, this is here's the English art department. Here you go. This is Alini, glamorous Alini, ourselves, Suzanne, Alia, getting our BFDG award. So thank you.
Oh, fabulous. And then let's talk a little bit about That's Life bit, because I remember actually seeing that when I was younger, when it went out. And it's a fascinating bit of TV history, really. Talk about how you created the That's Life set, and how hard is it to find period studio equipment from the 80s?
Well, that's a good point. Do you want to talk about hiring the period film equipment?
Yes, that was very touch and go, because the Crown was using this at the same time. There seems, I think there's only it was sourced through one main man, and he was the only person in the country that had these cameras. So it was, to pin it down, I think we even had to move the shoot day by 2 days to accommodate it, because it hinged on those cameras being there. It was very important to tell the story. And
another layer of verisimilitude came from the fact that our director had first started out as a BBC trainee, and he had been working on this show, not this particular episode, but he was always a stickler for accuracy, which total respect, but he was particularly fastidious about all the equipment, and it was difficult. And, you know, for our budget, it was a stretch. We had to use I mean, I've actually just done another show which was also needing to recreate 80s, 70s and 80s television sets. There aren't very many television studios which look correct, so you're fairly limited in where you can be. There's a couple around London. We shot this at Pinewood, and there are in fact a couple of companies that do period camera gear, but it seems to be very much in vogue, and it's quite expensive, and you obviously need people that can operate it. So, and I think that what you can see here is these hanging monitors, which we wanted to see for the storytelling. They had to be mocked up because we couldn't find ones that worked that we could suspend. So that was difficult. And we didn't have much money, so we had a very small build window at Pinewood to get it in. And the set was all built. Our construction team in the UK were based in Whitstable, so they had to bring it all up, and they did a brilliant job. It was amazing, but it was definitely sort of overnight turnarounds, and but very, very emotional, I think, for everybody on set witnessing those scenes being shot. We also had to find other places that were supposed to be within the BBC, and this sort of crashed into the unfortunate death of our Queen, and our locations for the BBC, which were within, in fact, our production offices were all too close to the centre of town. We weren't allowed to use them or go to the offices, so we had to, at the last minute, find somewhere else, which was Swiss Cottage Library, which was a last minute addition, which is used here and for some other 80s sets. But you have to just sort of roll with it, as we all know.
Yes, gosh. Wow. I mean, dealing with the death of a monarch is not really something you expect to deal with on a normal job, is it?
No.
It was rather amazing though, wasn't it? In a lot of the screenings, a lot of those kinder children would be in the audience. So, they would come, and then, James would say, please stand up. And it was so moving.
Yeah.
I mean, it was unbelievable. It was a very emotionally charged project to work on.
So they were in the audience when we were shooting it, but they were also in the screening audiences. So they were really trying to involve as many people as we could that had experienced it. So it was big responsibility.
And how was that with the Czech crew as well? Is that something, do you think they felt that responsibility as well?
They definitely did, because most films go to Prague to be, sort of a cheaper version of going to Paris. And this story was a real Czech story, which they were very proud of what had been achieved, and it was a really significant part of their history. So I think for them, for us to be making this film there, they were amazing. They were really helpful, and I think there was strong investment in the story from both sides.
Yeah, the prop team were amazing.
Should we talk about the refugee camp, Philippa?
Oh my goodness, yes, that's what I was thinking of.
Let's hear about that.
Well, I mean, they were there for, I think that was sort of 3 weeks prep, and the prop team was so generous. I mean, it was very hard, very tough. I have this sort of overriding memory of them with those, not flashlights, but sort of torches on their heads as the light was going, and we'd all start sort of be working in dim light, but with torches on our heads, because there was, locations.
At the end, I've got some picture of you. Here they are. There's you.
Really,
it's definitely a hands-on job.
I mean, people were ill. They were, coughing.
It was a difficult location. I think what we decided with the refugee camp is that we did take a bit of a leap. There were horrific refugee camps that sprung up around Prague when the children were arriving, in droves. Because we were also aware of what was going on in Ukraine at exactly the time we were prepping this, and everyone was used to seeing pictures of children being kept in sports halls, places like that. We decided that we would try and also use some kind of big atmospheric interiors, as well as the actual camps. Lots of them were in smaller buildings, and we found an amazing site which was in the north of the country, it was actually, I mean, in a way, just as we were witnessing the parallels with what was going on in Ukraine, we were also witnessing the decline of the industrial world in the Czech Republic, because it was actually still an operating steelworks a lot of it was semi-derelict. And by the time we shot there, which was maybe 6 weeks after we'd first recorded it, had actually completely closed down, and that was quite extraordinary. But we had this amazing building, and these are some visuals that we did of the exterior and the interior. So we created these 2 big sets, and we didn't really have the resources to do one, but as Philippa said, the set decorating department, that this was their sort of tour de force, and we were starting shooting there almost immediately. We arrived in Prague, and it was a few hours drive away, and lots of extras and atmosphere, and it was a big tour de force. And here it was a fantastic team. Not very many of them. They were brilliant.
They were brilliant. We watched the state funeral on your iPad. Do you remember?
Yeah.
Along in a van. To this
Surreal.
Yes, I know, it was really surreal.
Well, we're just coming up to the final few minutes, so if there's any questions that people want to ask, please feel free to put them in the chat box. But also, if there's any other pictures that you want to show before we finish up, if there's anything that we haven't covered or missed, or something you feel strongly about.
Was lovely.
Oh, Schubeck, yeah.
Schubeck was. Yeah.
So Schubeck was basically the reason that we'd gone to the amazing hotel where we ended up having to build our Hampstead interior, was because we wanted to create this Hotel Schubeck, which was the center of where our characters were staying, and where they sort of ran their operations when they get kicked out of the BCRC. So it was where lots of meeting was going on. It's where the Nazis start to arrive, and it was the sort of, I suppose visually it was the sort of heart of the glamorous side of being in Prague at that time. So we had a lovely exterior in Prague, which was this one in the old town, shooting day and night. And then we had an interiors which we created in this castle, which was a bit outside Prague. And Philippa, there's quite a lot of images here from the set decoration, so perhaps you want to talk about that.
Well, we sort of put a palette together, and the drapes were made, the nets, the carpet. You sort of designed the carpet. I mean, given we were a very tight budget, Prague is amazing in terms of what it can produce. We could never have done this in England on our budget. But I mean, it sort of beautiful transformation of this, what is, it's a beautiful building, but tired, very tired. And it was fantastic to be able to draw upon all their resources, and the craftspeople, their drapes people, and everyone went the extra mile. And we did get a lot from Berlin for this set as well, for the big pieces, for a hotel, like reception desks and bars and all of that. But the lights, I think quite a few of the lights had to come over from England, because there aren't runs of anything. So.
Oh, there we are again. That's Team Slappy.
That's Team Hotel.
We had 2 different set decorators in Prague. That's his second team.
They were, yes, they split it up. They had a very good system, because I suppose the refugee was such an enormous set to do, and it took up so much time and energy. There was a separate Petra focused on doing Schubeck and gathering together all these wonderful materials and things, which we were able to choose.
Yeah. And there's stuff readily available there if you want to go out and, if you've got those carpets, it's all stuff that you can get in stock.
It has to be made. This was made.
That was made.
So
that was our we designed that, and we had that made.
I see.
That was designed by our
things like drapery and stuff.
No, the drape resources, again, they were made. So that's what I'm saying.
Right.
We couldn't to have done this in England on this budget would have
Yes,
been very
it would
different.
have been a fortune.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But they have wonderful resources, and the stained glass, that was all.
Yeah, we made all the stained glass. I mean, I'd say that it's always difficult, I think, trying to do that graphically on a budget, because to be honest, by the time it's backlit, because this was printed digitally, it looked amazing when it wasn't lit, but once it's backlit, it sort of bleaches out a lot. So I think it's quite hard to do that without making it somehow three-dimensional and using some kind of paint on it to really get the feeling of stained glass. But I mean, it was. We did do a lot of work, again, in a short amount of time in the space, which is, it's a bit like one of the locations you get around London that's used a lot for all sorts of period films. So it had that tired feeling about it. But I think, we did quite a lot of painting, as you can see in some of these finished shots. I mean, we painted it and gilded it, and it had actually very good scenic painters there, and transformed it, and it did work very well for our set. It had this rather lovely staircase in it.
Beautiful elements.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. That's brilliant. Well, thank you. We're kind of pretty much bang on the money, just coming up to the 8 o'clock. So just time to say thank you very much to Christina and Philippa. It's fantastic to see into your world and what you created. It's a remarkable job.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Not at all. It's been very enjoyable. And there's more information about the BFDG, including membership, and you can find that at britishfilmdesigners.com. Thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.